dad was the eldest son of a family that lived in Preston. He had a brother who was 7 years younger. He'd had a sister between them who had died, but his father sadly died at age 34 from a heart attack after he'd been singing in the choir at church. So his mother had a hard time bringing up two sons on her own in the days before there were benefits. She took him washing, worked in the mill, did lots of hard things, but she managed to bring up his sons successfully. And my father went to be a sheet metal worker. He did actually pass for the grammar school, but because she was on her own, she couldn't afford to do that. So he left school at 14 and went to be a sheet metal worker. My mother lived with her parents in Ashton. She was the only daughter. There were two sons, Phil, who was older than her, and Dick, who was younger. And both her parents died young. Her mother died before my mum and dad got married. They were due to be married in May, and at the beginning of May her mother died, so they postponed the wedding until October. And shortly afterwards her father died. So in actual fact I only ever had one grandparent. My mother met my father through church. They went to Emmanuel Church and my mother was teaching there, and that was how they met. They got married when she was 27 and my dad was 24, and they went to live in a rented property in Walkie Lane in Fulwood, part of a larger house called Uplands, which has now been partly demolished and partly made into a housing estate. After a couple of years living there, my father took up a newsagent shop in Ripon Street in Preston. By that time my mother had to pack up work. In those days when you got married you had to leave teaching, so she helped in the shop with my dad. And 3 years after they got married, I was born while they were in the shop. I was born in a private nursing home in St Thomas's Road, which is alongside Moor Park. I was there till the age of 3, and I enjoyed being in the shop. I liked to see all the people, and I think they liked to see me. I was very blonde and they used to come and pat me on the head as they came in for the shopping. But it was evident that the war was approaching, and my dad wanted really to go and serve in the war. But he went to work for English Electric, and they moved out of the shop and moved to a house in Beacon Grove in Fulwood. My dad went to the Army, the Air Force and the Navy, but none of them would take him because they said his work was more important, because at that time they were starting making aeroplanes, so he was on what they called a reserved occupation. We lived in Beacon Grove, and as the war started my mother had to go back to teaching. She went each day to Tarleton on the bus, and the people next door, who lived next door to us, took care of me while she was out at school. When I was 5, I was due to start school, but got whooping cough and then German measles, and in those days you were considered infectious for several weeks, so I was a term late starting school. and I went to Food and Cadley School, and the day that I started school, the teacher, who was called Miss Addison, sat me at a desk for 2 people, but there was no one sitting in the other side, and I thought, this is great, I've got a whole desk to myself. But then this boy came in wearing dirty clothes, smelly, big boots, and apparently he worked on a farm and he'd been mucking out the cows before he came to school. And he unfortunately sat next to me. He later turned out alright and finished up one of the leading counsellors for Preston, so it was alright. His name was John Winterbottom. There were quite a lot of people who came from outlying areas those days, because a lot of the schools had closed down and they joined a lot of schools together, and most of the Catholic schools closed, so they came to Food and Cadley as well, where normally they would have gone to their own school, which was St Vincent's at that time. We had large numbers in the classes. There were actually 48 in the class that I was in, but the first class was a nice class to be in. We had a fire with a big fire guard around it, and we liked to get close to there when we were having story times. I had already learnt to read at home, so a lot of the work that they did in that class, I was put on a table by myself to read anything that I wanted to. Lots of books piled up on the table and I could read what I wanted. But I did enjoy the music lessons. I was able to play the cymbals, and I stood on a box and there were music cards all around the room for different instruments, mostly just percussion instruments, and I had the cymbals and I stood on this box and had to follow the notes on the wall. Then we moved to Miss Tomlinson's class next, where we really got down to some hard work, and I enjoyed school and I made quite a lot of friends and moved through the school until I got to about 8 years old, when they realised that several of us in the class were way ahead of the others and they moved us up a class, so I was with older children. When I got to the 11-year-old class, I was only 10, but we were allowed to take what was then called the scholarship and then became the 11 plus, although we were only 10. And I took that exam, and I can remember the headmaster coming to my house and saying to my mother, I'm sure she's done well, but they may not let her pass it because she's so young. But in actual fact I did pass it, and I went to Balshaw's Grammar School at Leyland when I was 10, when most people were 11. And I had to go on 2 buses to get there, one bus into Preston, the normal service bus, and then the school bus, which was called the S12, which took us right to the school gates. It seemed a long day at first, but I soon got used to it. But I'd not been there very long when there were enormous floods, and that frightened me because I thought I wasn't going to get home. But it all sorted out and I managed it. I wasn't keen on sports, but I did like the academic work there. And at in the second form, I was actually top of the class twice and received a prize at Prize Day. In my first term at Balshaw's, they realised that I was quite interested in music and good at singing, and they put me in the choir and said I was the youngest person that they'd ever had in the choir at school, and we sang at speech day and had carol services and various things like that. And I remained in the choir until I left school. When I was 15, I was then in the 5th form, due to take O-levels, but for 2 years they had an age restriction on it, and those of us who'd gone at 10 and were then in the year for taking the exam, we're not allowed to take it because we haven't turned 16. So we sat in a separate room, there were about 5 of us, and took the exam on our own, and sadly all of us passed because the teachers marked the exam papers that we took, but it wasn't allowed to be credited. So some of those 5 stayed down a year to repeat the exam, but I moved into the 6th form, and the headmaster, Mr. Oldland, had this system where he sat on the stage, you went up one set of stairs and he told you what you were going to take, you went down the other set of stairs, and that was it. And he said to me, no discussion at all, he just said to me, English, French and Latin. And I went down the other stairs and that was it. I went into the 6th form to do English, French and Latin, even though my best subject was maths. So I did a year of English, French and Latin. The English was okay, the French I loved, the Latin I hated. I could do the grammar, but the books that we had to study were terrible and I was having nightmares. So after several months, my mother went to see the headmaster and said, could I change? And he was very reluctant, but said yes, if I stayed down a year, then I could change to what I thought I was better at. So I stayed down in the lower 6th another year and did maths, physics and chemistry. So then, of course, I had different friends in that year, but it worked out okay. And I did maths, physics and chemistry for 2 years, and 6 weeks before the exams, the A-levels were due to be taken, I got yellow jaundice, and I was off school for quite some time, and I wasn't allowed to have any books to study at all. So this worried me because I didn't think I would be able to take my exams, but they allowed me to go in and take the exams, and I managed to pass the physics well. And in those days, if you just didn't pass, if by only a mark or 2, they granted it you at a lower level, at the O level. So I got the maths and chemistry at O level. The maths, the teacher was not very good, and none of us actually passed the maths that year. So I did the maths later and managed to get it after I left school. I had sufficient to go to college, and initially when I was in my early teens I'd wanted to be a nurse, but a friend of mine died and that put me off, and my mother said, why don't you go in for teaching? And it seemed okay, so I went into teaching, and I went to Didsbury Training College at Manchester, and it was a 2-year course then, and I went with the intention of teaching science to secondary children, but they sent us out on visits to schools and sent me to a horrible secondary school and a most beautiful nursery and infant school, and that was to make me change my mind to train for younger children. Which the year that I was 4 was quite traumatic for me really, because there were lots of infectious diseases going around at that time, and Olive, who lived next door, and Stanley, who lived across the road, got diphtheria, and then I got scarlet fever, and I had to go to the isolation hospital for 4 weeks. The isolation hospital later became the continuation hospital on Longsands Lane, but is no longer there. It was quite a happy time in there. We played, even though it was the war, we didn't realise the war was going on while we were in there. But we couldn't see our parents. They came to visit us, but we had to talk through the window. And they came round and inspected us every morning for our nails, our fingers and our toes, because some people got gangrene with it. Fortunately, I didn't get any complications at all. Some people lost the hearing and some people's sight was affected. But we used to sing a lot. The nurses had us singing, and there was one girl, I think her name was Laureen, and she was about 15 when I was 4, and she taught us all to sing Land of Hope and Glory. So every evening before we went to sleep, the whole ward sang Land of Hope and Glory. And there was a field at the back. We thought it was a cornfield, but I think it was probably just tall grass, and they allowed us to go and play in that when it was sunny. It was quite nice there. And our parents brought us toys and games and books, but we weren't allowed to take any of them home afterwards. And the day that I was allowed to go home, we had to have a special bath, and they took us to this room, and it was a bath with about, I don't know how deep it was, but it seemed very deep, because in the war you could only have 5 inches of water in your bath, but this was far more than that, and it was a muddy brown, and I wondered what it was, but I realised as I grew up that it was probably disinfectant. And we had to have this bath, and then we were taken to the matron's house, and we were given banana sandwiches, which was quite a delicacy because there were no bananas available for most people during the war. And then a car came with my mother in, I suppose it was a taxi, and I was allowed to go home. And on the table when I got home, there were 3 jigsaws, a book, a game to make flowers out of wax, and something to make little baskets using cane and raffia. Those were my new toys, because I'd had to leave everything behind at the isolation hospital. I played with those and was happy to see my family, and then my mother said, "We've got the best surprise of all, because when you're going to be 5 on your birthday, you're going to have a new brother or sister." So I was very excited about that. Unfortunately, 2 months before the baby was due, my mother fell downstairs, and they weren't prepared for her at the hospital, and although the baby was born, sadly it didn't survive, and she was called down, but I never saw her. And then 3 years later, another child was born. That was my sister Jean, and I loved Jean a lot, although there was quite a gap between our ages, and we grew up together, and I looked after her a lot when she was small, but then as I went to grammar school we drifted apart, and only got together again as we grew up, but sadly she died 20 years ago. When I went to school I had lots of friends, but my 2 main friends were Pat Hull and Joyce Harvey. Pat Hull lived up Tag Lane, and all her relatives lived round her, and they seemed to have beautiful houses. Joyce lived in a more modest house, but it was a very welcoming family and they always made me feel at home there. I keep in touch with both of them still, and Pat actually married Peter Jackson, who was in the same class as us at Ford and Cadley. He went on to Kirkham Grammar School, Pat went to Queen Mary's School as I went to Balshaw's. Joyce came to Balshaw's with me. We had lots of fun. We went across all the fields round Lightfoot Lane, which are now developed and all houses, but in those days there were lots of fields and we were just allowed to roam. With Joyce we tended to go on our bikes to Squire Anderton's Wood, and I remember loads and loads of bluebells there, and at the top of the road there was always a little stall that sold homemade lemonade, so we used to go on our bikes, pick bluebells, have a glass of lemonade and then come home. And because there were no cars about and very few people really, because most of the men were in the war, we were allowed to wander much as we wanted to. As long as we were home for tea time, we used to just wander all over the place. Although it was wartime, during the day it was alright, we enjoyed ourselves, but at night time where we lived it was quite scary really, because we were close to the railway, and at night time the German aeroplanes used to follow the railway line because that was the only identification they had. There were no all the signposts had to be taken down, and even notices on shops that identified where they were had to be either taken down or painted out. So they used to follow the railway line to identify where they were. So almost every night there was an air raid warning to say that the Germans were following the railway line. So when the sirens went, initially we went under the dining table, my mother and my sister and myself. My dad was usually at work or fire watching as they call it, and later we got a shelter that fitted into the house. There were two types of shelter, an Anderson shelter which people had out in the garden, and the school had them where you went down into the ground to shelter from the air raids, or there was a Morrison shelter which was metal and constructed inside your house, and we had one of those in the front room, and we used to sometimes go in there, and we had a mattress in there and could sleep in there at night if we wanted to. But it was quite handy because the top of it was quite an area, and if I had my friends round we used to have concerts and dance on the top of this Morrison shelter. So yes, the daytime was quite fun, but the night times were pretty scary in the war. Just stop it a minute. Although I had two friends, Pat and Joyce, and I did go out with them during the summer holidays and things like that, generally after school they went to their homes and I wasn't allowed to be with them then. But in Beacon Grove where I lived, it was a small cul-de-sac and I was the only girl, so most of my friends there were boys of my age, and so the games we played were football, cricket, swinging on the lamppost with a rope. There was a piece that stuck out at the side and you fastened a rope to it and swung around the lamppost and then back again. It was quite fun. And then we played just across the road, farmy, can I cross your mucky bridge? And you had to say only if you're wearing a particular colour, and then somebody had to try and catch you. Then there was hide and seek and tig, and we we used to go onto the school field. Now, there had been railings around the school field, but in the wartime, they collected all the metal that people could spare, pans and railings, anything like that, to go to make aeroplanes. And so all the railings have been taken down, and if you went through particular gardens you could get onto the school field, and we used to play French cricket there, and somebody's father had carved out a rough cricket bat for us, and we used to play. And my main thing, which was you used to hit the ball and then say BT, and I used to like to shout BT. Now what's BT? Batter's time. So you go one way, and then to get back to where you batted from, you batter's time. The person whose garden we used to go through was Stanley Billington. Now Stanley Billington actually turned out to be Chris's first boss when he started at British Nuclear Fuels. But Stanley was quite a character when he was a lad. He was an only child, and his parents were older and liked to give him all that he wanted, but he got some quite nasty things really, because he had a chemistry set and he set fire to the house with that. He had a saw, a fret saw, which he cut himself with, but most of all he got an air gun and he shot himself in the eye and was blinded in one eye. So it was quite catastrophic really, but it was good fun. So there was Stanley, and there was Jerry Ferris, and Mickey Fairclough and Jimmy Somerville. Those were the ones that I used to play with. There was quite a gap. They were my age, and then there was a gap of about 10 years, and then there was another group of older children. There was Olive, who we still sometimes see at church. She's well into her 90s now. And there was Jerry's brother Keith, and Kathleen. There were quite a few, but there was a big gap between, there was nobody in between. And then there was the next lot, which was my sister Jean's age. Now then at school, when we were about 8, we had sewing lessons, and they used to get old flour bags, and to unpick them, then they were washed, and we put them over the desk to keep all our work clean. We had 2 classes together of girls. I don't know what the boys did. They probably did woodwork or something at the time that we were having needlework. But we had the 2 ages together, the 2 classes, and my cousin Marjorie, who was a year older than me, was in the same class as me. And she sat next to me to do our needlework. I was the thimble monitor to go out, and everybody had to say what size the finger was for a thimble to sew with, and I was the thimble monitor. And then Marjorie came and she said, I've got an idea one day. If we lift up these cloths that were the flour bags, we could get to the desk underneath, and with your needle you could draw a picture. So I said, oh, that's a good idea. So she said, I'll show you. So she got her needle and she made 2 marks on the desk with a needle. So I said, oh, that's good. It went into the varnish on the desktop, and I drew a little house. Just as I was putting the roof on, the teacher saw us and came over, was quite angry, and sent us both to the headmaster, Mr. Allen. And he said, what have you done, you see? So I was trembling and didn't say anything, and Marjorie told him that we'd been scratching on the desk. So he said, what for? So she said, oh, well, you could make pictures with your needles. So I said, yes, but that destroys the desk. So she said, yes, but seemed a good idea. So he said, did you do it? So she said yes, and he said to me, did you do it? And I said yes. So he said to Marjorie, what did you do? She said, I just draw 2 lines. So he said, right. And he went into his office and came out with a cane. So he said, tell me again what you drew. So she said, 2 lines. Hold out your hand. So she held out her hand and he gave her 2 whacks on her hand. So he said to me, what did you draw? So I said, a house. So he said, oh, how did you draw it? So I showed him in the air how I'd drawn a house. So he said, oh, that's a lot of lines. I'm sorry, but you're going to get a lot of whacks. So I don't know how many I got, about 7 I think. And that was the only time I ever had the cane.
You know the bit which I've said about making more sense than me.
I'll talk about my leisure time when I was a child. I was quite friendly with Olive Singleton, who lived next door. Although she was 9 years older than me, she was like a big sister to me. And when I was about 6, she gave me some stamps that came from all over the world. I think she'd saved some of them, but also her brother had been around and sent some to her. So she gave me these stamps, and my mum bought me a stamp album which gave the countries on the top of each page, and then you had spaces for putting the stamps in. I put all these stamps that Olive had given me, and I decided that this was something that I was going to have as a new hobby. So each week, part of my spending money was spent at the local post office, where they had cards of stamps hung up on a rail in the shop, with little packets of mixed stamps in, and each week I used to go and spend 3pence or 6pence and buy a bag of stamps, and then I went home and you get about 8 or 10 stamps, and I found the places where they belong. And this continued for about 10 years. When I was in my teens, I joined what was called the Matlock Stamp Company, and they used to send me a book of stamps each week, and you took out what you wanted and sent them the money, which was then a postal order. They don't have them anymore, but you used to buy a postal order and send the money to them that way. So I collected quite a lot of stamps, and I still have the stamp album with all the stamps in that I had. Some of the countries that I put stamps in for no longer exist, and some have changed the names, and some of them, none of the stamps that I have are worth very much, but it's interesting to look through them occasionally. I also used to read a lot. Every minute that I had spare, I read. I read all the books that we had in the house that were suitable for children. I shared books with friends. I exchanged books on a temporary basis with friends of my mum. And of course I joined the library, and I used to often go after school to the library, which was near the Black Bull on Garstown Road. It still is there. And I enjoyed looking, and I could get 2 books, a fiction book and a non-fiction book. And each day I used to go and I'd get a non-fiction book and a fiction book, and I'd go home and I would read them by the next day. But in the holidays, because I had more time, I'd finish these books quite soon, and one day I went back to the library in the same day to change my books, and she said, I'm sorry dear, we can't change the books because we haven't sorted the cards out yet. You have to wait till tomorrow. and I was quite miffed really that I couldn't change my books, but that was how much I used to read. Another thing I did was to have pen friends. It started with, I don't know why we got it, but we used to get the what was called the Preston Guardian. It was actually from the Farmer's Guardian, and it came out on a Saturday, and they had a children's page, and they asked for people who wanted pen friends, and I got a pen friend who was called Dorothy, like me, and she lived in St Helens, and I'd never heard of St Helens. I thought it was a long way away, but of course it isn't. And I wrote to her for quite some time, and then this same page in the newspaper wanted people to write to girls and boys abroad, and I finished up having lots of pen friends. I had 2 in Canada, 1 in Holland, 1 in Australia, 1 in New Zealand, 1 in Scotland, the 1 in St Helens, and 1 in Denmark. Oh, and 1 in France. But the one that I wrote to most of all was the one I had in South Africa, and she was called Elizabeth, and I wrote to her for a long time until we were about 16, and then because we were doing exams we stopped writing, and gradually all the pen friends that I had were lost, so I've no idea what happened to them, but I did enjoy writing to them. Usually about once a fortnight I would send a letter, because some of the letters went by airmail, but some went by sea and took a long time to get there, and of course a long time for a reply. Other things that we did, I occasionally went to the cinema. There were lots of cinemas in town then, or probably about 20, I would think, and most of them changed the films halfway through the week on a Wednesday and then again on a Sunday, and sometimes I would go to the cinema. But what I did enjoy was going to the Hippodrome, which was on Friargate. It then became CNA's, and it's now where Wilco is. And they had a group of people called the Solberg Players who used to put on a play each week, and some of the people who were there became quite well known. John Dirth was one that I remember. He became quite well known, but sometimes they had visiting actors and actresses, and I did enjoy going to live performances at the Hippodrome.
So, being the 75th anniversary of the day, what's your recollections of the day or the week?
When I was at Forward and Cadley School, each week we had a singing lesson with the headmaster, Mr. Allen. We used to go into the hall, and he would stand on the stage, and there was a big dark sheet, I don't know what it was made of, and he used to write on this big sheet in chalk the words of whatever we were singing. And on this particular day we were sitting in the hall and we were learning a new hymn, and it was very warm. It was a lovely day, very warm, and he had the doors open to the outside, and we were singing away, and then suddenly he said to us, "Stop." And he went off the stage, out through the door, up the path to Blackbull Lane, and there were lots of people going past there cheering, and we wondered what on earth was going on, but we just stayed in the hall. And then he came back and he made a victory sign to us, and then he seemed a bit overwhelmed really, and he put his head in his hands, and we all looked at each other and wondered what was going on. And then he said to us, "The war is over, it's victory." And then we could see all these people cheering in the road, and he said, I think you'd all better go home and tell your mums what has happened. So we dashed out of the hall, got any belongings that we had, and went home and told our mums that the war was over. I don't think my mum believed it at first, but when she saw the people getting excited, she realised that it really was true, and she put on the radio, and of course she was told that yes, the war was over. Now it took a little time for us to have the celebrations. I don't know just how soon it was, but we had a street party to celebrate the end of the war, and the things that we'd have, we used to have blackouts. You couldn't show a light in the room, so all the blackouts were finished, and we also had a big bonfire at the end of the road to celebrate that it was the end of the war. During the war there was a shortage of lots of items of food and clothing, and so that people had a fair share of everything, the government organised a rationing scheme. Everybody was issued with a ration book which allowed them certain quantities of things. The amounts that were allowed for meat, bacon and bread were quite sufficient, and you would think they were okay for today. The amounts for butter, margarine, lard would now be considered excessive. We had more than we needed. But milk was in short supply, and eggs were the ones that were considered very short. People were allowed 1 egg per month. Now you would think people would have their own chickens and have their own eggs, which some people did, and people who lived in rural communities tended to get more. And there was a lot of what they call the black market, where people who had things sold them at inflated prices to other people. But of course eggs don't keep, but the people learned to store them in what we called then water glass, but is actually isinglass, and you put them in a bucket and mixed up this mixture and poured it on, and it set, and there was like a skin over the top, well, a hard skin over the top, and you just got the eggs out as you needed them. Things like tin goods and cereals you could buy on a point system. Clothing was rationed, and even material to make clothes yourself was rationed. And when people got married, people tended to club together their points so that people could get wedding dresses. And some people made wedding dresses out of old parachutes, and parachute silk was considered a delicacy, really. Now rationing, or sweets were rationed too. Milk was rationed, but expectant mothers and children under 5 got extra, and those people were also issued with orange juice and vitamins, cod liver oil and vitamins to keep the strength up. Rationing went on, surprisingly, although the war finished in 1945, rationing went on until 1954. That was when it was finally finished. There were a lot of other shortages too. People probably wouldn't realise it now, but even long after that, people didn't have tellies, fridges, cars, washing machines. There were no mobile phones, and even landline phones were not very popular. In the road where I lived as a child, there would probably be about 30 houses and only one person had a telephone. If you needed a telephone, we used to go to that house and say, please, would you ring up for us? And they had a little box and you put some money in for the use of their phone. That was shortages and rationing. One incident during the war that had a big effect on me was when I was about 8. Yes, I would be 8 because my sister had been born, she was born when I was 8. So I'd be about 8 and a half. And we were in the school hall, all together, the whole school, having an assembly. And suddenly this noise came over the school. Ooh, ooh, ooh. And everybody wondered what on earth it was. And then there was this sudden bump, and we learned that it was an American plane out of control, and the pilot had seen houses and the school and had just managed to avoid crashing into them, and this plane landed just over the railway in a field on Boys Lane, which is now some flats and houses. And it had a big impact in the pupils in the school because many people live near there and wondered if the plane had landed on their house. My own house was very, very close to where the plane landed. And we found out the next day that the pilot, an American, had been killed. We had a collection and to buy a wreath for the pilot who died for his funeral. Nothing much was said about this for quite some time, but a few years ago it was brought up in the school about this incident, and I actually went to the school and talked to the present children about what had happened, and I understand that later a plaque was put up in the school corridor about this. From a very early age I remember having music in my life. My mother was a competent pianist and her brother was at one stage a professional singer. So I love music and I like listening to the radio as well with music on. But when I was 4, my mother decided that the time had come for me to learn the piano. And the first teacher that I had was called Miss Bowen, and she lived on Plungington Road at the beginning near the roundabout at Lytham Road. And she had a very strange way of teaching the piano, I thought. She had a piece of paper that went behind the notes that had the names of the notes on, but I found this difficult to understand, and after going to her for a few months, my mother decided that this wasn't the way that I was going to learn. So she asked around the neighbours and found that there was another teacher called Miss Melling who would come to your house. So Miss Melling came to my house to teach me, and although I learnt quite a lot from her, she was quite a harridan really. If you played a wrong note, even though I was so young, she used to rap my knuckles with a pencil, and I've learnt since that she did this with everybody that she taught, so this must just have been her way of stopping people from playing wrong notes, but it just instilled fear into me. And I can remember one piece of music was called Dolly's Funeral, and there was a picture of a child with this dolly with the cover over her face because the dolly had died. And for a child this was quite intimidating really, and I can remember every time the book was opened at that page I began to cry, and what happened? I got a rap on the knuckles with the pencil. Anyway, I did learn quite a lot from Miss Melling, and I stayed with her until we actually moved from Forward, which I'll tell you about later. But we moved to New Hall Lane, and the teacher that I had then was a couple of blocks further along. I can't even remember the lady's name, but she was quite a good teacher and I learnt from her. But she had a cupboard with all this music in, and once you played one piece you went on to the next shelf, and I seemed to go through the shelves quite quickly, but there was another girl that I knew who seemed to get stuck on one particular piece, and this piece was called Rose Dreams, and I can't remember what the girl's name was, but because she walked about on New Hall Lane with this piece of music under her arm, Rose Dreams, everybody called her Rose Dreams. Anyway, after I'd been to this teacher for about a year, by then I'd be about 15, she said to my mother, "I'm sorry, but I can't teach your daughter anymore. She'll have to go to a different teacher." So my mother asked around who was able to teach more than this lady could, and we found that the best teacher in Preston was a man called John Robinson, who was actually a blind organist. He played the organ at St Paul's Church, which later became Red Rose Radio, and he was extremely good, and I went to him from that time until I got married, and I took lots of exams and I got through all the work until I actually passed grade 7, and I think he would have taken me further, but at that time I was getting ready to get married and I didn't want to take any more exams. I when I was 16, we moved from the newsagent's shop to a greengrocer's shop in Blackpool Road. This was a very different kind of business, and although I still helped in the shop, it wasn't quite the same as delivering papers and counting the money, although I did still do that for a little while. It was serving potatoes and cutting bacon and things like that, and mainly delivering orders that people left at the shop. They would come with their order and we would make up a box of what they wanted, and then I would deliver it to their home. We didn't go very far, it was just perhaps a couple of streets away, but we stayed there for 2 or 3 years, but unfortunately my father developed dermatitis, and because he had cracks in his skin, the potato soil got in and made it worse, and he had several stays in hospital, and eventually they had to give up the business. He couldn't keep on with it any longer. And while they were there was also another incident where there were some meat pies that we sold in the shop, and if any were left over, they used to use them for the tea or whatever was available, cakes or pies. But these pies were from Cookson's bakery, and there'd been a rogue batch and people got ill with them, and both my mother and father were very, very ill with this food poisoning. And Olive, that I've mentioned before earlier in my talk, who lived next door to us at Beacon Grove, came to help us out in the shop because mum and dad weren't able to deal with food anymore. So for several weeks Olive came and took over the shop, and I just helped behind the scenes. Mum and dad quickly recovered, but unfortunately there were some people in Preston who'd been affected by this bug who sadly died. However, this didn't have any effect on them wanting to sell the shop. It was my dad's bad hands that made them give it up in the end. And I went to college, teacher training college, while they were at the shop, and while I was there they moved to Leah Road in a house that had been recommended to them by a friend of my dad's, but I think it wasn't a very good recommendation because although it was a nice house, there were quite a few things wrong with it, and it was expensive to run, and Dad was without a job for quite some time, so it must have been very hard for my mum. I was away at college, Dad had no job, and my sister was probably coming up to going to grammar school at that time. Anyway, after struggling for a while then, my dad managed to get a job back at English Electric, which then became British Aerospace, and so it was a little bit easier for them, but they decided to move from Leah back to Fulwood, and they moved into a bungalow at Eastgate. It only had 2 bedrooms, but by that time I was engaged and they knew that I wouldn't be there very long, so 2 bedrooms was quite adequate for them, and they stayed there quite some time and were very happy there. It was quite a nice bungalow.
She had some experiences of them.
When I went to Balshaw's Grammar School at the age of 10, there were several of us who went from Fulwood and Cadley School, but we were split up into different forms when we got there, so although I knew some of the people there, I made new friends, and my main friend at Balshaw's was called Anne Brennand. She lived at Charnock Richard on a farm and I spent a lot of my holidays there with her family. They were quite disorganised, but they had a big farmhouse, and I used to go and help picking peas and beans and working in the farmhouse with her mother, who had also been a teacher like my mother. But they were a friendly family, and I got on with them for ages. But later Anne moved to Canada, and I lost track of her. When I was about 14, a new girl came into our farm. She was called Irene Robinson, and she moved from East Lancashire, and she'd originally been at Clitheroe Grammar School, and she got transferred to Balshaw's, and I became friendly with her. She left school at the end of the 5th form, and I was going on into the 6th form. She went to work at Siemens making electric light bulbs, and I still remain friends with her. And the works where she went to had a social club on Cottam Avenue near Ashton Park. They had a meeting on Saturday night where they had old-time dancing, and I think the men used to also have snooker and darts, but it was the old-time dancing that was really quite interesting, and she invited me to go with her. So I asked my parents could I go, and reluctantly they allowed me to go because they knew Irene and said it would be okay. So I went with her, and although a lot of the people were quite older, we didn't really mix with them, but there was a group of younger ones, and there was Irene and myself and Anne and Fred, Harold, Roy and David Henderson, who actually had been in the same class as me at Ford and Cadley. So I felt quite at ease with this group, and we had quite some fun. And as well as meeting there on Saturday nights, we used to also meet at each other's houses during the week or on Sunday evenings. And when it was my 18th birthday, that wasn't a special birthday then because you didn't come of age till you were 21, but when I was 18, we had a mini party where we lived on Blackpool Road at the time, and all these people from Irene's Siemens Club came for my 18th birthday, and we had quite some fun. We didn't really do much. We had a special food, and I don't think we played any games, we just chatted. But during the evening, Roy asked me to go out with him, and I was quite surprised because he'd actually been going out with Irene, but he asked me to go out with him, and I said yes, and we went to the pictures during the week, and that was the beginning of our courtship. We went out for several months, but as I was going to college, we decided to split up before I went to college so that I could concentrate on my studies. So I went to college at Manchester, and there I made a new group of friends. There we had the 6 of us that were friends there were Nancy, Janet, Shirley, Margaret, Marlene and myself. Nancy was my main friend because she was doing mostly the same things as I was. She was studying for infant teacher training, and she also did music and maths like I did. The only subject that was different, I was doing science and she was doing geography. But even with those, we were together a lot because we went on field trips, and those 2 subjects tended to go together. And Nancy was a Quaker, and she actually lived at the Friends Meeting House at Brigg House in Yorkshire, and I went many times to her house and met her family. There were a mother and father and a brother and a sister. Her sister was actually married and lived quite close by, and she had 2 children at the time. And I don't think there were ever less than 14 people sat down for a meal at that house, because her mother was very, very sociable, and it seemed to invite all sorts of people in. And I enjoyed going there. It was a very friendly place. And I also went with Nancy to lots of other Quaker places for weekends, and we had a lot of fun there. At the end, we also went to musical concerts together because we were both interested in music. We used to go to the Halley because that was in Manchester and on our doorstep, but we went to lots of other things. And one of the highlights of the college musical scene was we had a man came to play the harpsichord, and with him was a man playing the recorder, and it was Joseph Saxby who played the harpsichord and Carl Dalmesh who played the recorder. And I didn't realise it at the time, but Carl Dalmesh was the one. If you buy recorders now, you probably buy Dalmesh recorders, and Carl Dalmesh was the one who'd instigated these. And it was a very interesting concert that these two men gave. Just before the end of our 2 years at college, the geography and science groups had a field trip, and it was a week at Ambleside, and we stayed in the YMCA, and it was a mixed college, so there were men and ladies there. The men were probably a few years older than the girls, because they had done the national service before going on to training college. We had to do all sorts of things on this field trip, which were quite interesting but very taxing. So in the evenings we tended to just relax. But next to the last night that we were there, one of the men said, "Come on, we're all going to the pub." So there were about 20 or 25 of us all went together to the pub, and to my horror, the landlord said to me, "I'm not serving you," because I was short and looked younger than my age. And he said, "She's not 18, which was the age you had to be to buy a drink. I'm not serving her." And Nancy spoke up and said, "She's my friend, she's the same age as me, she's actually older than me. She's not 18, she's 19. And actually I was 20 at the time, but Nancy had got mixed up and said I was 19. And the landlord said, "I'm still not serving her." So one of the men went over to the bar and said, "Look, we're a group of teacher students. In a few weeks' time, she's going to be in school teaching children. She is the age you can serve her." So the landlord relented, and I got my drink. While we were there, Nancy persuaded me that because we'd finished our studies, that perhaps I should get in touch with Roy again. So I did. And nearly every day we were there, he wrote me a letter and I wrote him a letter, and that was when we started going out again. Whilst I was at college, I received a grant from Preston Education Authority, the princely sum of £90 in the first year, which enabled us to buy any books that we needed, and then a lesser amount of £60 in the second year. Because we got this grant, we had to agree to teach for 1 year back in Preston. Other people who got grants, sometimes a lot more than we got, didn't have to say that they would teach back in their hometown. So when we actually left college, I was going back to Preston. Nancy went to Sheffield, and the other 4 of our friends stayed in Manchester. Jobs were very hard to get at that time, and my first application was for a post at Lear Endowed School down Lear Road, which would have been very handy because it was close to where we were living at that time. There were 103 applicants for that job, and I did get shortlisted to be interviewed. There were 5 people interviewed for the job, and unfortunately I didn't get it. The headmistress came to my house afterwards and said she was very disappointed because she wanted to appoint me, but the niece of one of the governors had actually got the job. However, I kept applying for other jobs, and the next one that I applied for was for St Matthew's on New Hall Lane. I thought I wouldn't get this job because there was somebody who was a supply teacher who was teaching the class, and she had applied for a permanent position. I thought she would get it, but they gave it to me because they wanted somebody who would play the organ for occasional weddings in the church and also do the music in the school. And so I got the job, and it was teaching the 6-year-olds, and I started this job and I shared the hall with the headmistress. There were just screens in between us. It wasn't a very happy school, but I got used to teaching there. In my first year we had an epidemic of Asian flu, and I was off ill. I didn't know what had happened for the first 3 days, and apparently all the children in my class were off at the same time. When I recovered after a week and went back to school, the other teachers were off ill, and I was left with the children who'd returned, 240 children, all on my own. Anyway, I managed for about 3 days, and then the other teachers came back. After a year, I changed from teaching the 6-year-olds to teaching the reception class. Now, in reception classes now, I think there are about 18 to 20 children. In those days, there were a lot more, and I had 49 children in my class, including triplets who were only 3 years old, and the mother couldn't cope with them, and she'd applied to get them to come to school. Even though I had already 46 children in my class, these 3-year-old triplets were allowed to come, so it was a very taxing year. At the end of that year, during that year, we got engaged in my first year teaching there, and at the end of that year, Roy was moved with his job to London. So during the second year, although it was difficult teaching, I knew that I would be leaving soon because we were going to get married and we were going to stay in London where I was working. We got a flat in Enfield, and it was a new one. Roy had arranged to buy it, so he was organising all the house dealings at that end, and I was dealing with the wedding arrangements at this end. Anyway, everything worked out, and we got married on the 9th of August 1958 at Emmanuel Church. My sister Jean and Roy's sister Gillian were bridesmaids, and the best man was Roy's brother Peter. The vicar who took the service was the Reverend Fordham, who was well known in Preston at that time. It poured down all the morning when we were getting married, but the sun came out in the afternoon, and we went on a coach to Ambleside for our honeymoon. We got on the coach at Preston bus station, and there were only single seats, and I sat in one and Roy was sitting further along the bus in another one. But it was obvious that we were newlyweds and somebody changed places and we were able to sit together. As we were coming along the A6, we got near to the end of the road at Regent Drive, and all the other wedding party, my parents, Roy's parents, the bridesmaids, the best man, were all at the end of the road shouting, and so all the bus cheered us along. We got to Ambleside and the sun came out and we had a 3-day honeymoon at Ambleside. In my first job, the salary that I received was £304 per annum. That was less than £6 a week. And when we got engaged, we began to save up, which was quite difficult on this sort of money. But Roy had found the maisonette in Enfield, and the price of that was £1,750. We both saved like crazy, didn't go out anywhere, saved every penny that we could. Roy had managed to secure a mortgage of 80%. 90%. And so we would have to pay 10% towards it, which we thought we could just about manage. Then 6 weeks before we got married, they told us that we could only have an 80% mortgage. This was because so many people were after the property. They thought that a lot of people would back out, but we didn't back out. We managed to find the extra 10%, but it meant that when we got married, all that we had, we bought a cooker to go in the kitchen. My mother had actually left me her piano in her will, but decided it was silly waiting for her to die that I could take the piano, because I played the piano a lot. We had 2 armchairs that I had bought as a teenager when I had a room of my own. Roy's parents gave us a studio couch for a wedding present. That was our seating and our bed. We had a kitchen cupboard that my mother gave us that I painted up and painted the kitchen too. We had a card table to eat off and a bureau that had also been mine in my little room. And that was all we had. We had 2 bedrooms, but all that was in the bedrooms were 2 bikes. We had, one of our wedding presents had been a green rug which we had in front of the fire, and on one occasion somebody came to demonstrate a vacuum cleaner, and all that we had was the rug, but he needed the commission from the demonstration. He was a young man too, and so we took pity on him, and he sprinkled dust on the rug and vacuumed it up, and that was his demonstration, which was quite funny really. The whole maisonette was tiled throughout with, I've forgotten the name of the tiles, but they were like marley tiles, so there weren't bare floors that we had, and we could choose the colour of tiles that we had. So it was okay, and gradually we managed to furnish it. We bought a bedroom suite and a bed and a table and chairs, and we're quite comfortable there. I managed to secure a job at St James's Church School, which was a decent bus ride from where we lived, but also an easy walk, and it was a very, very happy school. I loved it there, and the staff were lovely, the children were great, and I made 2 good friends there, Hazel and Kathleen, and I kept in touch with Kathleen until just a few years ago when she died. When I started at the school, there was no head teacher because the head teacher had gone off sick and they were about to appoint a new one. We actually had quite fun on the day that the new head teacher was appointed because we actually took bets on who was going to get it. But I can't remember who won those bets, but the actual head teacher that was appointed was called Mr. Holton, and he'd come from Bicester with his young family. They were a lovely family and often invited us round to their home. He was a bit scatty in some ways, and on one occasion I can remember we had to go about half a mile down the road to eat our school dinners in the village hall, and he used to go on his bike. And one time when we got back to school after school dinners, he said, "My bike's been stolen." He thought he'd left it at school, and he actually rang 999 for the police, and because we were in the area that was covered, he got straight through to Scotland Yard. And everybody said, "Oh, they're coming from Scotland Yard about his bike." And then later he discovered he'd left it at the place where we had our school dinners, so he was terribly embarrassed about it all. But he was a lovely man, and he was a very spiritual man. He used to go to church a lot and brought his family up that way, and I used to do hymn practice with him. He used to teach the children and I played the piano. And he had 2 sons and a daughter, and they often came visiting into school and we saw them at his home. Now, 2 years ago at Easter on the television, it was from Salisbury Cathedral, and the bishop there was called Nicholas Holton, and I thought, that rings a bell. It sounds like Mr. Holton that I used to teach with. It's not a very common name. And I looked him up, and the information about him said that he'd been born at Bicester, and I thought, this is no coincidence, it must be the same person, it must be Mr. Holton's son. And I was going to write to him, but I was a bit wary of doing it. I thought, you don't just write to a bishop. But a year went by, and when it came round to Easter again, it reminded me. So last year I actually wrote to him and told him the story about his father and his bike and how happy I'd been at the school. And he wrote me a lovely letter back saying yes, he remembered he'd sometimes gone into the school and that his father also had been very happy at that school. Hazel and Kathleen and I used to once a week not go to school dinners. We used to go to each other's home and do sandwiches, and I can remember Kathleen's sandwiches were always crab, but they were lovely sandwiches and we had a great time. And she lived in a room in a lady's house, and Hazel was married and she had a flat quite near to the school, and we used to sometimes go to her house. She didn't have a kitchen, she just had a big bedroom and a small lounge and a bathroom. And we said, well, how do you manage for the kitchen? And she said, oh, well, I manage, I have a little gas ring and I do my washing in the bath. And we thought that was extremely funny. But she actually moved to Kent and I lost track with her. But as I say, Kathleen I kept in touch with for a long time. We were very happy living at Enfield in this maisonette. It was close to the railway, it was on good bus routes, and loads and loads of shops nearby. There was a butcher's, a newsagent's, a grocer's, a greengrocer's, baby and wool shop, and a big library, and we started going to the church there, and the people there were very, very kind, and we kept in touch with them for a long time too. Okay.